The arrow came out of the dark so fast that Daniel Ramsay barely heard it split the air before it struck the stone an inch from his skull. And then there was a shape between him and the second shot. A shape with shoulders like a hauled ship's beam and twin blades already singing free of their sheaths. "Down!" Urzoth Ironhide snarled, and shoved him flat against the cliff stair with one hand while the other caught the second arrow out of the air, snapped it against her thigh, and hurled the broken shaft back into the darkness like a curse made of wood. Daniel hit the stone hard enough to knock the breath from him, tasted salt dust and old mortar, and from that low, undignified vantage, he watched the orc woman who had been assigned to guard him for 11 days plant her boots wide on the narrow stair and become something out of an old ballad, lit gold by the guttering torches bolted into the cliff wall, her braided black hair whipping in the sea wind, her leather cuirass creaking as she turned side-on to make herself a smaller target, and still somehow filled the whole night with her presence. A third figure broke from the rocks below, cloaked, fast, blade already drawn, and Urzoth went to meet it without a single word of warning, because warning was a courtesy she did not believe her enemies deserved. Daniel watched her cross 8 feet of broken stair in 2 strides, watched the moonlight run silver down the twin curved blades she carried, watched her catch the assassin's first cut on crossed steel, and answer it with a headbutt that dropped the man like a felled tree. She had his throat under her boot before Daniel had even managed to push himself up onto his elbows. "Yield or die," she said, and her voice, low and rough as a millstone grinding grain, did not shake at all. "I would very much prefer die." The man beneath her boot made a small, strangled sound that was not quite words, and somewhere down among the rocks, a fourth shape turned and fled rather than face what she promised. Urzoth let him go. She was not interested in the ones who ran. She was interested in the one who had put an arrow a finger's width from a carpenter's skull, and she was going to have answers before the tide came in. Daniel got his legs under him at last, heart still slamming, and found that his hands, which had built half the roof beams of Saltmere Priory over the last 11 days, were shaking too badly to be of any use to anyone. He looked at the woman standing over the pinned assassin with her chest heaving and her braid come half undone across one shoulder, and he thought, absurdly in the middle of all that danger, that he had never in his life seen anything so alive. "You are hurt," she said, not looking away from her captive, though somehow she had seen him touch his own scraped temple where the stone had bitten him when he fell. "I am fine," Daniel said, and his voice came out steadier than he expected. "You are extraordinary." That got her attention, just for a heartbeat, one dark eye flicking sideways to study him the way a woman studies a wall to see whether it is load-bearing or merely decoration. "You are supposed to be a lord," she said. "Lords say prettier things than that." "I am a poor lord then," Daniel said, and did not know in that moment how close to the truth he had come. The assassin under her boot began to babble something about coin, and a name Daniel did not catch, and Urzoth's attention snapped back to him like a bowstring released, and just like that the strange, charged silence between them broke, and the night became noise again, shouting from the gatehouse above, torches bobbing down the stair, Lord Havard Reeves' reedy voice demanding to know what in the name of the crown had happened to his precious envoy. It would be 3 more days before Daniel Ramsay worked up the nerve to tell anyone the truth of who he actually was. It would be far longer before he understood that the woman who had put her body between him and an arrow that first night had a truth of her own buried just as deep, and that when it finally came out, it would nearly cost them both everything they had begun, in that short violent handful of days, to want. Saltmere Priory sat on a shoulder of black rock jutting into the gray strait, half a day's ride from the nearest human town, and a full day's walk from the nearest orc encampment, chosen for exactly that reason. It had been a monastery once, before the border wars burned half the kingdom's coast and the monks fled inland with their books and their bells, and for 20 years it had stood empty, its roof fallen, its great hall open to gulls and weather, a ruin the color of old bone above a sea that never stopped its restless grinding at the rocks below. Now, with the war finally guttering toward exhaustion on both sides, the king of Aldermore and the war chief of the Ironhide clan had agreed, through 6 months of careful, brittle correspondence, that this dead place would be reborn as neutral ground, the first stones of a peace neither side entirely trusted the other to want. Daniel Ramsay had been hired for his hands, not his politics. He was a millwright and carpenter out of Fenwick Harbor, a quiet coastal town 2 days south, and he had spent 11 years learning from his father, and then 11 more years alone after his father's heart gave out at a lathe, how to make old, broken, forgotten wood remember what it was for. He had answered the king's call for craftsmen because the pay was good and because, if he was honest with himself in the dark hours when honesty came easiest, he was tired of being the only name on a small shop's ledger, tired of eating supper across from an empty chair, tired of a loneliness that had gone on so long it no longer even ached, only sat in him like a stone he had learned to carry. He had not meant to become a lord. That had been an accident of tides and paperwork, and one very unlucky, very convenient resemblance. Lord Cedric Ashworth, the king's own nephew, had been meant to arrive at Saltmere a full fortnight before the treaty talks began, sent as a hostage of honor, a gesture of good faith that said, plainly, "The crown's own blood will sleep beneath your watch, Orc chief, so you will know we do not come to you with false hearts." But Cedric's ship had been caught in an autumn storm off the Thistlerack Shoals and driven far south, and word of his survival, for he had survived, bruised and furious and 3 weeks behind schedule, would not reach Saltmere for some time yet. Daniel, who had shared a berth with the young lord for 2 days out of Fenwick Harbor before their ships parted at the strait, had been asked, as a courtesy between traveling men, to carry ahead a satchel of letters bearing the royal seal, since Daniel's smaller craft would make better time in the shallows. He had arrived at Saltmere Seastair alone, travel-worn, carrying another man's satchel and another man's letters, and Lord Havard Reeve, who had never in his life laid eyes on Cedric Ashworth and who had been half-mad with worry for a week already, had taken one look at the royal seal in Daniel's hand, and the fine cut of the borrowed traveling cloak Cedric had pressed on him against the sea wind, and made an assumption so complete and so relieved that Daniel had not managed to correct it before he was being bowed to by an entire household staff. "My Lord Ashworth," Reeve had said, wringing his hands, "we feared the storm had taken you. The Ironhide envoys arrive within the week. You must not let them see any hesitation in you, my lord. The whole piece rests on the appearance of trust. Do you understand me? The appearance." "I am not," Daniel had tried to say. 3 separate times, and 3 separate times Reeve had steamrolled over him with some fresh catastrophe of protocol, until Daniel had found himself standing in a borrowed lord's chamber with a title he had not earned, a task he had not asked for, and no clear way to unwind the lie without. As Reeve put it in a cold sweat that night, insulting the Orc delegation so badly that 6 months of careful diplomacy would collapse into ash, and the border wars would resume by spring. "Just until the true Lord Cedric arrives," Reeve had begged him. "A fortnight, perhaps less. You need only sit at the table and nod gravely, Master Ramsay, and let the Orcs believe the crown trusts them enough to send its own blood into their reach. No one need ever know." Daniel had agreed, God help him, because he had looked at the terror in Reeve's eyes and understood that the old steward believed, entirely, that a war would restart over his mistake, and because some stubborn, foolish part of Daniel Ramsay had always found it easier to shoulder another man's burden than to protect his own comfort. He had agreed to be a lord by day, and by night, when no one was watching, he had gone on doing the only thing he actually knew how to do, which was climb the scaffolding in the ruined great hall with a mallet in his hand and put the broken bones of Saltmere Priory back together, board by board, beam by beam, because someone was going to have to, and because it was the only hour of the day when he did not feel like a fraud. It was on one of those nights, 3 days after the arrow on the stair, that Urzoth Ironhide found him 40 feet up a rebuilt rafter with sawdust in his hair and a chisel between his teeth. And everything she thought she understood about the human lord she had been sent to guard came apart in her hands. She had been assigned to him not as an insult, though her father, War Chief Drogeth Ironhide, had certainly meant it as a kind of test. A shield guard from the clan set to watch over the human hostage, both a courtesy and a warning, proof that the Ironhide clan honored its word by keeping the boy lord alive, and a blunt reminder that they could just as easily choose not to. What her father did not tell the human delegation, what almost no one at Saltmere Priory knew, was that the shield guard he had sent was not merely a warrior of no particular note. She was his daughter, his only living heir, and she wore a plain warrior's braid and answered to nothing but her given name because an heir known to be within arm's reach of a human keep was an heir who might be taken, and Drogeth Ironhide had buried too many kin already to risk the last one on ceremony. So Urzoth Ironhide climbed the scaffolding after Daniel that night not because duty demanded she supervise a lord's late hours, but because she had heard hammering coming from the ruined hall at an hour when lords ought to have been asleep in feather beds, and her instinct, honed on a decade of border skirmishes, told her that anything unexpected near her charge deserved investigation. What she found, 40 feet up, balanced on a crossbeam with the sureness of a man who had walked such heights his whole life, was Lord Cedric Ashworth with his fine borrowed cloak discarded on a sawhorse below, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, his forearms corded with the kind of muscle that came from years of labor and not a single hour of it from swordplay, and his hands. She noticed his hands most of all, because an orc noticed hands. Hands told you everything about what a person truly was: scarred, calloused, stained dark along the fingers with years of oil and resin, nothing at all like the soft, pale hands of the human nobles she had glimpsed at the treaty table. "You are no lord," she said, from the base of the scaffold, and watched him nearly fall to his death out of pure startled guilt. He caught himself on the crossbeam, chisel clattering down through the dark to bounce off the stone floor, and for a long moment he simply stared down at her, sawdust drifting in the torchlight between them like snow that had forgotten what season it was, and Urzoth felt something in her chest do a slow, unfamiliar turn, because even caught red-handed in whatever deception he was building, the man did not look afraid of her. He looked, mostly, exhausted and a little relieved, as if some weight he had been carrying alone had just found a second pair of hands. "No," he admitted, climbing down with a carpenter's easy economy of motion that told her, even more plainly than his hands had, exactly what he was. "I am not." "Then who are you?" Urzoth said, and set one hand on the hilt of a blade, not quite a threat, more an old habit. "And why does the whole priory bow to you as though you were?" he told her. He told her all of it, standing there in the ruined hall with sawdust on his boots and the sea wind moaning through the unfinished roof above them, because he had been holding the lie alone for 3 days, and something about the way she looked at him, direct, unflinching, utterly without the fawning deference the human staff gave him, and equally without contempt, made him feel, for the first time since his father died, that here at last was someone he did not have to perform for. When he finished, Urzoth was quiet for a long moment, studying him in a way that made his skin feel too warm despite the cold sea wind, and then unexpectedly she laughed, a real laugh, low and rough and startled out of her, the first he had heard from her in 3 days of careful formality. "A carpenter," she said. "My father sent his own daughter to guard a carpenter, and the whole kingdom of Aldermore is too frightened to tell him." Daniel's stomach dropped so fast he nearly lost his footing on the sawdust-covered floor. "His own daughter," Urzoth Ironhide said, and lifted her chin the way a woman does when she has decided, on impulse, to trust someone with something dangerous. "Heir to the Ironhide clan, sent under a guard's name because heirs who are known to be heirs tend not to live long near human keeps. So, it seems we are both liars, Daniel Ramsay. What shall we do about that?" He looked at her for a long moment, really looked, the way he had not quite let himself before, at the strong, clean lines of her face, the dark eyes that missed nothing, the way her fitted leather cuirass, laced tight down the front and cinched at a waist that curved like a drawn bow before flaring to hips built for planting a stance no enemy could break, did nothing at all to disguise the fact that she was, without any argument he could construct, the most beautiful thing he had ever stood in a room with. "I suppose," he said, "we keep each other's secrets, since we are, apparently, the only two honest liars for miles." Something in her face shifted then, not quite a smile, something warmer and more dangerous than a smile, and she stepped closer, close enough that he could smell leather and wood smoke and the clean salt of the sea wind on her skin, close enough that his pulse climbed his throat like a man scaling a rope. "I do not make bargains with men I do not respect," she said quietly. "You have just earned my respect, carpenter, by building this hall with your own hands, instead of ordering some other poor soul to do it while you sat by the fire and called it lordship. That is worth more to me than any title your king could hang on you." "Is it?" Daniel said, and his voice came out lower than he intended. "It is," Urzoth Ironhide said, and did not step back. The treaty talks began 3 days later, and Daniel Ramsay stood at the head of the human delegation in a borrowed lord's finery he had not asked for, sweating through the collar, while War Chief Drageth Ironhide's envoys filed into the newly repaired courtyard of Saltmere Priory to a crowd of watching soldiers, servants, and clan warriors who had never once in living memory stood this close to each other without weapons already drawn. It was Urzoth, standing a half-step behind his shoulder in her fitted leathers with her twin blades sheathed but not far from her hands, who murmured the coaching that got him through it, which orc gestures meant respect and which meant challenge, when to speak, and when silence carried more weight than words, how her father took insult easily but forgave quickly if a man showed no fear of him. Daniel followed her guidance like a man following a lantern through fog, and if Lord Reeve noticed how often the young lord glanced sideways at his own shield guard before speaking, he said nothing, too grateful the boy was managing at all to question how. War Chief Drageth Ironhide was a mountain of a man, gray-tusked, scarred across one eye from some old battle, and he studied Daniel across the negotiating table with the flat, assessing patience of a hunter deciding whether prey was worth the chase. "You are younger than I expected, boy lord," Drageth said, his voice a landslide given words. "Your king sends children to sleep among wolves." "Your daughter tells me wolves do not eat what respects them," Daniel said, before he could stop himself, and beside him he felt rather than saw Urzoth go very still. Drageth's good eye swung toward Urzoth so fast that half the courtyard flinched, and for one horrible heartbeat Daniel thought he had just undone every careful lie they had built between them. But Drageth only barked a short, surprised laugh, the tension in the courtyard breaking like a held breath finally released. "She has been talking to you," the war chief said. "Good. She talks to almost no one. It means she thinks you are worth the trouble of words." Beside Daniel, Urzoth's jaw tightened, and later, when the day's talks had ended and the courtyard had emptied of everyone but gulls and wind, she found him alone at the cliff edge behind the priory's western wall and struck his shoulder hard enough to stagger him. "You nearly gave us both away," she said, though there was no real heat in it. "I know," Daniel said, rubbing his shoulder. "I am sorry. It was reckless." "It was," Urzoth agreed. And then, quieter, watching the sun bleed orange and gold into the churning gray sea below them. "It was also the first true thing anyone has said at that table in 6 months. My father believed it because it sounded like a man who actually knew me, instead of a man reciting a treaty clause." They stood together at the wall as the light died, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and Daniel found himself in no hurry at all to break the silence. "My kind does not wait," Urzoth said eventually, apropos of nothing he had asked, her eyes still on the horizon. "We do not sit idle for any man's word, carpenter. An iron-hide warrior moves when she chooses to move, speaks when she chooses to speak. We do not linger at doorways hoping a man will notice us." "I did not ask you to linger," Daniel said carefully. "No," Urzoth agreed. "You did not." She did not explain further, and he did not press her, but the next evening, when his work on the great hall's roof beams ran long into the dusk, and he came down the scaffold aching and covered in dust, he found her waiting at the cliff wall exactly where she had stood the night before, arms crossed, watching the same restless sea, and she did not look at him as though she had been caught at anything, only glanced over with an expression that dared him to comment on it. He did not comment on it. He simply came to stand beside her and watched the sun go down with her, and something in his chest, some old cold stone he had carried since his father's funeral, cracked just slightly and let a little warmth in. It became, without either of them naming it, a ritual. Every evening, whatever the day's business demanded, and the days grew harder as the true weight of the treaty settled over Saltmere, as border skirmishes further north threatened to unravel 6 months of careful diplomacy before the ink was even dry, as Lord Reeve grew more frantic and War Chief Drogheth grew more watchful. Every evening Daniel would come down from whatever labor or false lordship the day had asked of him, and every evening Urzoth Ironhide would be waiting at the cliff wall, watching the sea, saying nothing about why, and every evening something between them grew a little less careful, a little more certain, until the waiting itself became the truest thing either of them had. "You know," Daniel said one evening, perhaps 2 weeks into the ritual, the sky above them streaked violet and rust, "you keep telling me your kind does not wait on a man's word, and yet here you are." Urzoth's mouth curved, slow and dangerous and warm all at once. "I am not waiting on your word, carpenter. I am waiting because I choose to be here when you arrive. There is a difference." "Is there?" Daniel said, echoing her own words back to her from that first night in the hall, and stepped close enough that he could feel the heat of her. "There is," Urzoth said, not moving away. "One is obedience, the other is desire. Do not confuse them or you will insult me badly." "I would never dream of insulting you," Daniel said, and reached up, slow enough that she could stop him if she wished, to tuck a loose strand of dark hair back behind the curve of her ear, and she did not stop him, only watched him with eyes gone dark and unguarded in a way he had not seen from her before. "Good," she murmured, "because I have killed men for less." "I believe you," Daniel said, and kissed her. It was not a soft, hesitant thing. Whatever had been building between them across 2 weeks of stolen evenings broke loose all at once, and Urzoth's hand fisted in the front of his shirt and pulled him hard against her, and Daniel forgot, entirely, that he was supposed to be a lord, forgot the treaty, forgot the war, forgot everything except the heat of her mouth and the low sound she made against his lips that undid something fundamental in him. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing hard, the sun had gone fully down and the stars had come out sharp and cold over the Black Sea, and Urzoth pressed her forehead to his, tusks careful not to catch on his skin, and said, in a voice gone rough with something that was not anger, "I did not come to this cliff for a carpenter, Daniel Ramsay. I came for a lord to guard a treaty. I did not ask to want you instead." "I did not ask to be wanted at all," Daniel admitted, "by anyone in a long while. I am not sorry it was you." She kissed him again for that fiercer, and he let himself, finally, after years of carrying his loneliness like an old familiar stone, put it down. The confrontation came 8 days later, in the priory's outer bailey, in full view of half the treaty's household staff, and a full patrol of human soldiers who had never made peace with the sight of an orc warrior walking freely inside their walls, let alone one who was rumored, in the ugly way rumor traveled among frightened men, to have bewitched the young lord with some clan sorcery. It began with a soldier named Corliss, broad and sunburnt, and full of the kind of grievance that needed only an excuse to become violence, blocking Urzoth's path across the bailey with his spear lowered, 2 of his fellows fanning out behind him. "The orc witch does not walk this yard without escort," Corliss said, loud enough to draw every eye in the courtyard. "Lord's orders, or so I am told. Funny how she is always alone with him after dark, though. Funny what tales a man hears." "Stand aside," Urzoth said, flat and cold, her hand already drifting toward her blade. "Or what?" Corliss said, grinning at his fellows. "You will curse me too. Turn my lord into your creature the way you have turned his." He did not finish the sentence, because Daniel Ramsay, who had come around the corner of the smithy in time to hear every word, crossed the bailey faster than his sore, work-worn legs had any right to carry him, and put himself bodily between the spear point and Urzoth Ironhide's chest. "Lower that," Daniel said, and his voice, usually so quiet, cracked across the bailey like a whip. Every head in the yard turned. "Lower it now, Corliss, or I will see you and every man behind you stripped of rank and marched back to your garrison in disgrace. And do not think I lack the authority, because I assure you, I have more of it than you understand." Corliss hesitated, spear wavering, clearly unused to the borrowed lord raising his voice at all, let alone with this much iron in it. "She has done nothing but her duty," Daniel went on, not moving from where he stood, close enough to the spear point that Urzoth's whole body had gone rigid with the effort of not simply shoving him out of the way and finishing the fight herself. "She saved my life on the sea stair, in case none of you were told, while you were all warm in your beds. If you have a grievance with an orc soldier keeping her word, you have a grievance with the peace your own king sent us here to build, and I will not stand in this yard and let you spit on it." The bailey held its breath. Corliss's eyes flicked past Daniel to Urzoth, who had not drawn her blade, who stood utterly still with an expression Daniel had never seen on her before, not fury, though fury was certainly present beneath it, but something closer to shock, as if a man had never in her memory placed his own unarmored body between her and a spear meant for her. Slowly, grudgingly, Corliss lowered the spear. "Apologies, my lord," he muttered, not looking at Urzoth at all, and the patrol dispersed under the weight of stares from the gathered household staff, who had clearly enjoyed the spectacle rather more than propriety allowed. When the bailey had emptied, Urzoth rounded on Daniel with her hands trembling not from fear. "You are a fool," she said. "You are a soft-handed carpenter with no blade and no armor, and you put yourself between me and a spear." "You put yourself between me and an arrow," Daniel said. "I did not see you complaining then." "That is different," Urzoth snapped. "I am a warrior. I am built for it." "You are. I am a man who has decided you matter to him," Daniel said, quiet now, all the borrowed iron gone out of his voice, leaving only the plain truth underneath it, "more than my own comfort and considerably more than my own skin." "I am sorry if that offends your pride, Urzoth Ironhide, but I will not apologize for meaning it." She stared at him for a long moment, chest still heaving, and then, astonishingly, she laughed, not the sharp bark of amusement he had heard before, but something softer, almost helpless, and she closed the distance between them and kissed him hard enough to bruise, right there in the empty bailey where anyone might have seen, though for once neither of them cared. "No man has ever stood between me and a weapon before," she murmured against his mouth. "I did not know I wanted that until you did it." "I will do it again," Daniel said, "as many times as it takes." "I know you will," she said, and there was something fierce and wondering in her voice, as if she had just discovered a country she had not believed existed. "That is precisely the trouble, Carpenter." That night, for the first time, she did not simply meet him at the cliff wall. She came to the small chamber where he slept, in his borrowed lord's finery he had long since stopped wearing after dark, and when he opened the door to her knock, she did not speak at all, only reached up and unwound the leather cord binding her braid, letting her dark hair fall loose around her shoulders for the first time since he had known her. And something in that simple, deliberate act told him more clearly than any words could have that, whatever walls she kept around herself, she had decided that night to lower them for him. What passed between them after that was not spoken of the next morning, nor did it need to be. It was written instead in the way Urzoth's hand found the small of his back as they walked the corridor to breakfast, in the way Daniel's fingers brushed the inside of her wrist when he passed her a cup, small unspoken proofs that something between them had shifted from wanting into having, and having into something that neither of them, in the privacy of their own hearts, was foolish enough to call anything less than love. But peace, like love, is a fragile construction, built board by board out of trust, and it takes only a single rotten beam to bring the whole structure down. The treaty was to be signed on the feast of the autumn tide, when the gray strait ran calm enough for both delegations' ships to make safe passage home, and in the days leading up to it, Lord Reeve grew nearly unrecognizable with strain, certain that some final catastrophe would undo 6 months of work in its last hour. He was not wrong to worry. Word had reached him 2 days before the ceremony that Lord Cedric Ashworth, the true envoy, had at last been found alive on the southern coast and was even now riding hard for Saltmere Priory, expected to arrive within the week after the signing, but not by much. "We must simply endure until the ink is dry," Reeve told Daniel privately, wringing his hands in the shadow of the newly rebuilt hall. "Once the treaty is signed, the truth of the mix-up becomes a minor embarrassment, easily smoothed over. Before the signing, it becomes a scandal that could unmake everything. You understand me, Master Ramsay. A few more days of lordship, and then you may vanish back into your carpentry with my deepest gratitude and a purse heavier than you have ever seen." Daniel understood. He hated it, hated the growing weight of a lie he had never wanted to tell in the first place. But he understood, and he agreed to carry it those last few days, not knowing that the lie was about to break open in the worst possible way, in front of the worst possible audience, at the worst possible hour. It happened on the eve of the signing, in the Priory's newly finished Great Hall, hours before the ceremony was to take place beneath the very roof beams Daniel had raised with his own hands. The hall had been decked with banners of both kingdoms. Orc clan sigils and Aldermore crests hung side by side for the first time in a generation, and the household staff and clan attendants were making their final preparations, laying long tables, hanging lanterns, when Daniel, exhausted and overwrought and unable to sleep, had gone to check one final time that the great doors, the ones he had built himself, the ones meant to swing open at dawn and let both delegations walk through together, as a symbol of the peace they had built, hung true on their hinges. Urzoth had found him there, alone in the lantern-lit hall an hour before midnight, running his hands over the doors he had carved with twin sigils, an Aldermore eagle and an ironhide tusk, entwined at the center where the two panels met. She had come to tell him, quietly, that her father had noticed the ceasefire delegation growing restless, that Kraga Bloodfang, a warrior of ambition who had long pressed for a marriage alliance between himself and the war chief's absent daughter, had begun asking pointed questions about where exactly the shield guard Urzoth disappeared to each evening, and instead, standing in the lantern light with the finished doors gleaming between them, she had found herself simply looking at him, at the exhaustion and quiet pride on his face, and had crossed the hall and kissed him instead of speaking a single word of warning. They did not hear the side door open. They did not hear the footsteps. It was only when a voice, sharp with fury and satisfaction both, rang out across the hall that they broke apart and turned, and found themselves staring at Kraga Bloodfang standing in the doorway with a dozen clan warriors and half the human household staff crowding in behind him, drawn by his shout, all of them staring at the sight of the king's envoy locked in an embrace with the war chief's own shield guard, hours before the treaty that was meant to end a generation of blood was to be sealed. "So," Kraga Bloodfang said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall, "this is how the human crown honors its word, sends a lord to seduce the war chief's own guard beneath his very roof." The hall erupted. Human soldiers reached for weapons out of pure startled instinct. Clan warriors surged forward, some drawing blades, shouting accusations of orc dishonor, of sorcery, of betrayal. Lord Reeve appeared from somewhere in the chaos, white as a corpse, shouting for calm that no one heeded. And into the center of it, drawn by the noise, strode War Chief Drageth Ironhide himself, his scarred face thunderous, his eyes finding his daughter's loosened hair and swollen lips and understanding, in an instant, precisely what he was looking at. "Urzoth," he said, and the single word fell into the hall like a stone into still water, silencing everyone. "Explain this." There was no lying her way out of it, not with 100 witnesses and her father's own eyes upon her, and Urzoth Ironhide, who had never in her life bent her knee to fear, drew herself up to her full height in the lantern light, her hand finding Daniel's without hesitation, without shame, in front of everyone. "I will explain it," she said, loud enough to carry to every corner of the hall. "I am not merely a shield guard, father. Forgive the deception. I am your daughter, sent here under another name for my own safety, as you commanded, and I have chosen this man of my own will with my own heart, and I will not stand here and let Kraga Bloodfang call it sorcery when it is nothing but the truth." The hall went utterly silent. Drageth Ironhide's face, for the first time in the entire negotiation, showed something other than iron control shock, and beneath it, a slow dawning fury that made even the bravest of his warriors take a step back. "You dare," he began, and then Daniel Ramsay, who had spent his whole life avoiding exactly this kind of attention, stepped forward beside Urzoth and spoke the second half of the truth before fear could stop him. "There is more," Daniel said, and his voice, though it shook, carried. "I am not Lord Cedric Ashworth. I never was. I am Daniel Ramsay, a carpenter of Fenwick Harbor, sent here to rebuild this hall. A mistake was made when I arrived carrying the true Lord's letters, and I was asked to maintain the deception so that the treaty would not be delayed by his ship's misfortune. I have carried another man's title for 3 weeks so that this piece could be built on schedule. I did not ask to fall in love with Urzoth Ironhide while I did it, but I have, and I will not deny it to save my own skin, not to you and not to anyone in this hall." For a long, terrible moment, no one moved. Then the hall broke into a roar of accusation and outrage that seemed likely to tear the fragile peace apart before a single word of it was ever signed, human soldiers shouting that they had been made fools of by a common tradesman playing lord, clan warriors, shouting that the war chief's own daughter had shamed her blood with a human deceiver. Kraga Bloodfang's voice rising above it all, gleeful and vicious, declaring that this was proof enough that the human crown's word meant nothing, and the treaty should be burned along with the hall that housed it. Lord Reeve looked as though he might faint. War Chief Drageth Ironhide looked at his daughter, and at the carpenter beside her, and at the chaos consuming the hall his own people had come to bless with peace, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, letting the storm rage around him while he simply thought. It was Urzoth who broke the silence, stepping forward, refusing to let fear or shame bow her head. "Kraga Bloodfang sent the assassin on the sea stair 3 weeks past," she said, loud and clear, and the hall's chaos faltered into confusion at the sudden accusation. "I have suspected it since that night and said nothing because I lacked proof, but I do not lack it now." She reached into a pouch at her belt and withdrew a broken arrow shaft, the very one she had shattered against her thigh that first night and kept, out of a warrior's habit of never discarding evidence, and held it up for the hall to see fletched in a distinctive dark green, bound with a particular red-dyed sinew that every clan warrior present recognized on sight. "This fletching belongs to Kraga Bloodfang's own quiver," Urzoth said. "I have seen him restring his bow with this very sinew 12 times on the border marches. He sent a man to kill the human envoy on the eve of these talks, hoping to collapse the treaty and force my father back to war, where his own standing as a war leader would matter more than it ever could in peace. He has been trying to destroy this treaty since before it began, father, and now that his sabotage has failed, he tries a subtler poison, turning this hall against me and against the carpenter, so that scandal finishes what his assassin could not." The hall's fury found a new target with dizzying speed. Kraga Bloodfang's face went the color of old ash as every eye in the room turned toward him instead, and he made the mistake, in his panic, of reaching for his blade. "Lies," he snarled. "Fabrication to save her own dishonored. Then you will not object," War Chief Drogoth Ironhide said, his voice suddenly very quiet, very final, the kind of quiet that came before executions, "to a trial by combat, Kraga Bloodfang, to settle the truth of it in the old way. If you are innocent, you have nothing to fear from my daughter's blade." Kraga's eyes darted around the hall, seeking allies, finding none. For even his own supporters among the clan warriors had gone still and wary at the sight of that damning arrow shaft, remembering, perhaps, other small oddities about Kraga's behavior these past weeks that they had not thought to question before. "I accept," Kraga spat, because pride left him no other honorable path, and Urzoth Ironhide's hand tightened around Daniel's for one brief, fierce moment before she released it and drew both her blades. They fought in the courtyard beneath a sky gone hard and starless with clouds rolling in off the strait, torches lining the walls, both delegations crowding the balconies and the bailey walls to watch, human and orc alike united for once in breathless silence as Urzoth Ironhide and Kraga Bloodfang circled each other across the stones. Kraga was larger, heavier, a brute of pure strength, but Urzoth was faster and angrier, and she fought with the controlled fury of a woman defending not just her honor but the man she loved, who stood at the edge of the crowd unable to help her with a blade but refusing to look away for even a second. Kraga's axe came down in a blow that would have split stone, and Urzoth rolled beneath it, came up inside his guard, and might have ended it there had he not caught her wrist and slammed her bodily into the newly repaired scaffold still standing at the courtyard's edge, the very scaffold Daniel had climbed a dozen times these past weeks. Wood groaned. Urzoth twisted free, but Kraga pressed his advantage, driving her back toward the scaffold's base, and Daniel, watching from the crowd, saw in an instant what Kraga did not, that the support beam Kraga kept forcing her against was one Daniel himself had left only half-seated that very afternoon, waiting on a final peg to be driven home. Daniel did not think. He simply moved, shoving through the crowd to the scaffold's edge, and as Kraga swung his axe again, driving Urzoth back against that same weakened beam, Daniel drove his shoulder into the loose support strut from behind. The whole scaffold section lurched, timber groaning, and Kraga, mid-swing, lost his footing on the sudden shift of ground beneath him. Stumbling half a step was all Urzoth Ironhide needed. She was already moving, blade flashing under the torchlight, and Kraga Bloodfang went down hard onto the courtyard stones with her sword point resting at his throat, and the whole crowd holding its breath around them. "Yield," Urzoth said, echoing, without meaning to, the very words she had spoken to an assassin on a stair 3 weeks before, "or die. I would prefer you yield this time, so my father may deal with you properly." Kraga Bloodfang yielded, spitting curses, and was dragged away by his own kinsmen in disgrace, and the courtyard erupted not into chaos this time, but into something Daniel had never expected to hear from either delegation. A ragged, astonished cheer, human and orc voices mixing in the torchlight, as if the sheer drama of it had burned away, for one night at least, 20 years of mutual suspicion. War Chief Drogoth Ironhide crossed the courtyard to where his daughter stood, breathing hard, blade still bloodied, and where Daniel Ramsay stood beside her, dust-covered and shaking with the aftermath of what he had just done. The war chief studied them both for a long moment, and then, to the astonishment of everyone watching, he laughed, a huge, rolling sound that seemed to shake loose the last of the tension in the courtyard. "A carpenter who breaks scaffolding out of love for my daughter," Drogoth said, "and a daughter who breaks would-be usurpers out of love for a carpenter. I have negotiated with kings, boy, and never once seen loyalty proven so plainly as this. Perhaps your king's mistake was not so grave a thing after all." A man does not need a title to be worth trusting. He needs only to be willing to put his own body between danger and the ones he loves. You have done that twice now, by my count." Lord Reeve, hovering nearby, looked as though he did not know whether to weep with relief or despair. "Then the treaty will be signed at dawn, as planned," Drogheth said. "Beneath a roof this carpenter built with his own hands, and I will tell you plainly, Lord Reeve, I trust that roof, and the man who raised it, considerably more than I would have trusted whatever soft lordling your king originally intended to send. Let it be known that a common craftsman helped hold this piece together with his own 2 hands, and let no one in either kingdom ever say again that only blood and title can build something lasting. Sometimes it takes calluses instead." The true Lord Cedric Ashworth arrived 4 days later, travel-worn and bewildered to find his own name had been borrowed and returned without incident, and he took the strange tale of the mix-up with far better humor than anyone had dared hope, delighted mostly that he had missed the tedious ceremony and arrived just in time for the feast instead. The treaty was signed at dawn beneath Daniel Ramsay's rebuilt roof, the great carved doors thrown open to let the first light of the autumn sun spill across both delegations, as War Chief Drogheth Ironhide and the king's official representative pressed their seals to the parchment that ended, at last, a generation of border war. Daniel stood at the back of the hall for the signing, no longer required to play any part at all, simply a carpenter watching the doors he had built stand open to a new piece. And it was there, in the golden morning light, that Urzoth Ironhide came to stand beside him, no longer needing to hide what she felt, her hand slipping into his in front of both her father and the entire assembled court, without a shred of hesitation. "They will write songs about this treaty," Daniel murmured, watching the 2 delegations mingle for the first time without weapons drawn, "and no one will ever know it was held together by a carpenter's lie and a chieftain's daughter's stolen evenings." "They do not need to know," Urzoth said. "We know. That is enough." That evening, once the feasting had quieted and the last of the celebratory fires had burned low, Daniel found himself once more climbing the familiar path to the cliff wall behind the priory, tired down to his bones, the weight of weeks of deception and danger finally lifted from his shoulders. He half expected, after everything, that Urzoth might not come, that, with the treaty signed and her true identity known to all, the strange, fragile ritual they had built between them might no longer be necessary, might dissolve now that the secrecy that had shaped it was gone. She was there anyway, waiting at the wall exactly as she had every evening for weeks, her dark hair loose around her shoulders in the sea wind, the stars beginning to prick through a clear sky above the endless black water, and something in Daniel's chest, seeing her there, loosened so completely that he had to stop a moment on the path just to breathe through the force of it. "You came," he said when he reached her. "I told you once," Urzoth said, not turning from the sea, though he could hear the smile in her voice, "that my kind does not wait on any man's word. We do not sit idle hoping to be noticed. We choose our own path, carpenter, and walk it on our own feet." "I remember," Daniel said, coming to stand beside her at the wall, close enough now that their bodies touched without either of them needing to think about it. "And yet," Urzoth said, finally turning to face him fully, her dark eyes bright in the starlight, "here I have stood every evening for weeks waiting for you, not because you commanded it, not because duty required it, because I wanted to see your face at the end of every day more than I wanted my own pride intact. Do you understand what that costs a woman like me to admit, Daniel Ramsay?" "I think I do," Daniel said softly. "It is the same thing it costs me to admit that I have never in my life wanted anyone the way I want you. Not a lord's daughter, not a soft life, not safety. You, exactly as you are, blades and pride and all." "Good," Urzoth said, "because I am done waiting quietly for you to say it first." And she reached up, unwound from around her own wrist a braided leather cord dyed dark with clan colors, the mark of an unmarried Ironhide woman, And before he fully understood what she was doing, she took his hand and tied it instead around his wrist, her fingers steady and sure despite the enormity of what the gesture meant among her people. "What does this mean?" Daniel asked, though something in his chest already ached toward the answer. "It means," Urzoth said, "that I choose you. Not my father's politics, not some clan alliance, not any words spoken over us by priest or chieftain. I choose you of my own will under this sky, and I will fight anyone who says a carpenter is not worth an ironhide's cord. My kind does not wait on a man's word to know our own hearts, but I will gladly spend the rest of my evenings waiting for yours anyway, Daniel Ramsay, because there is no word in any tongue I know sweeter than the sound of you saying you are glad I did." "I am glad," Daniel said, his voice rough with everything he felt and had never let himself hope for. "I have been glad every single evening you were standing at this wall, and I did not have the courage to say so until now. I love you, Urzoth Ironhide. I do not care that you are a warrior and I am only a carpenter. I do not care what anyone in either kingdom thinks a peace like ours should look like. I only care that you keep choosing to be here every evening for as long as we both live." "Every evening," Urzoth agreed, and kissed him then beneath the open sky, the stars wheeling slow and endless above the black, restless sea, the sound of the surf against the cliffs below like the world itself breathing out a long-held breath. There was no crowd to discover them this time, no scandal to survive, no lie left standing between them. Only the two of them, alone at the edge of the world they had helped remake, and the quiet, fierce certainty that whatever came next, war or peace, human suspicion or clan tradition, they would face it exactly as they had faced everything else since that first arrow on the sea stair. Together and unafraid. They stood at that wall a long while, wrapped in each other, the cord she had tied around his wrist dark against his skin in the starlight, a promise plainer than any treaty seal. And when at last they turned from the sea to walk back toward the warm lantern light of the rebuilt priory, Urzoth Ironhide laced her fingers through Daniel Ramsay's without a shred of the old wariness she had carried into that first meeting on the stair. And Daniel, carpenter, no lord, no soldier. Only a man who had once believed himself destined to eat every supper alone for the rest of his days, found that the stone he had carried so long in his chest had finally, completely, dissolved into something that felt, for the first time in more years than he could count, entirely and unmistakably like home. The treaty held. In the seasons that followed, merchants began to cross the border the two peoples had bled over for a generation, and the great hall at Saltmere Priory, doors carved with an eagle and a tusk entwined, became known on both sides of the Grey Strait as proof that peace, like anything worth having, was built by patient hands and stubborn hearts rather than by titles or decrees. Urzoth Ironhide remained at Saltmere at her father's request, no longer hiding behind any borrowed name, honored openly as his heir, and as the woman whose courage had helped save the treaty at its most fragile hour. And Daniel Ramsay stayed beside her, not as a lord and never pretending to be one again, but as exactly what he had always been, a craftsman who built things meant to last, who had, without ever intending it, built something far more lasting than any hall. A woman's trust, a woman's love, freely given and freely kept. And every evening, without fail, whatever the day had asked of either of them, Urzoth Ironhide came to stand at the cliff wall above the restless sea, not because any word of his commanded it, but because she chose, again and again, exactly as she had told him she would, to be there when he came. And every evening, Daniel Ramsay climbed the path to meet her, no longer a lonely man with an empty chair across his supper table, but a man who had been seen, entirely and without pretense, by the fiercest, most magnificent woman he had ever known, and chosen, not once, but every single evening after, for as long as they both should live.